the EU is a very complex organism, made up of sovereign states who have shed some of their sovereign powers in mutual interest to govern themselves and govern those areas of commerce and labor migration, all sorts of things, for the common interest. And it's an experiment in governance that a lot of people are paying a lot of attention to. Sadly, most of what people have heard about the EU in the last several years has been concentrated on the euro crisis, the financial problems, that have involved Germany as the rich country, and Spain and Portugal and Greece and some others on the poorer side, and they have a common currency, and they're trying to figure out how to manage that when you have a common currency but not common banking rules and all sorts of other complicated matters. What's distinctive about the British involvement is that you have not joined the Eurozone. You have maintained your own currency, and probably much to your credit. I think a lot of people think that's a wise move, and you're not likely to change it. But do you want to just say a little bit about that, the reasoning for maintaining the pound as distinct from the euro?
So, I mean, first of all, just in terms of context, it's worth remembering that only 17 of the 28 European Union member states are actually part of this common currency, the euro. And as you rightly say, the Eurozone was particularly hit by the recession and has faced a number of distinct challenges in terms of working out how best to overcome the challenges of the recession and put their own economies back on a steady economic track. For the UK, we are incredibly proud of the British pound sterling. It's been part of our culture and history for centuries. It's also been a crucial part of the global economy over centuries. And what we have been able to do with the British pound is retain both a strong sense of British identity in the global monetary climate, but also direct our own economic growth post-recession. And I think what we see now in terms of the broader global economic recovery is that the UK is really leading the pack in terms of how we're able to secure economic growth out of the recession that's hit us all globally.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, I think London is the #1 financial center in the world, or very close to it. If it's not #1, I think it's surpassed New York, just in terms of the volume of transactions that occur, in any one spot.
Yes.
And we know dollars are flowing through, and the pound is flowing out and in, and it's a marvelous place.
Absolutely,
lots of action.
and then even just recently we announced when the Chinese Premier was visiting the UK that London would become a renminbi foreign exchange hub as well.
And that's the Chinese national currency.
Exactly.
That's coming on strong as a global trading currency.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to circle back just for a minute to the prospect of a referendum on EU membership. And however likely or unlikely that is, it's speculation at this point. But we do hear, because headlines carry spectacles, that there's a party, a relatively new party, an independence party in the UK, and they're advocating, of course, removing Britain from the EU. Just for a moment, can you speculate on what might be some of the consequences if forever that were to happen, or ever, if that were ever to happen? What ramifications might it have for the UK? And I'm thinking really in relationship to the rest of the world. Because in my own mind, I'll just betray my own suspicions. If Britain were to remove itself from the EU, they would necessarily look more strongly to North America again, and of course the Asia-Pacific region, that you might change the emphasis of your foreign policy, the emphasis of your commercial activities, and Canada might become again a preferred option for investment and trade. But all that's speculative. I'm curious to know what has occurred in your own mind about what could happen.
So, as you know, the UK has always been a leading player on the global stage for centuries, and I have absolutely no doubt that that will continue. But if we're looking at European Union membership, and this is indeed what the Prime Minister has said himself, is that he believes that Britain's place is best in Europe because of the advantages that being part of not least a single market brings to the British economy. And so his focus, and mine as a civil servant as part of the British, working for the British government, is indeed to ensure that we are working towards this reformed European Union that looks at the issues I talked about earlier in terms of a disassociation between individuals and the centralised authorities at the European Union in Brussels, and looks at issues like, for example, non-completion of the single market. In still some aspects of single market, we haven't got a full and free single market operating in the European Union. So these are the key areas that the British Prime Minister David Cameron is focused on achieving. And he has very clearly stated that with this reformed European Union to work with, he is absolutely sure that Britain's place should be within the European Union.
Yeah. Could you elaborate just a little bit about the reform measures you're talking about, the dissociation of the individual with the supranational government? In a practical sense, what would be an example of that, and what would be a specific example of the unfinished single market notion? Because these terms are commonplace in the literature of the world economy, but they're not here in Montana. And people are interested in individual sovereignty, state sovereignty, national sovereignty, but we're not part of anything quite so ambitious as the EU in terms of layers of governance and arenas of governance. So just a little bit more specific about that will help us understand what you're talking about.
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of a single market, what we're talking about is really, in effect, a free trade area. So an area where if I am looking to trade in goods or services from the UK to France, to Germany, to Belgium, to other parts of the European Union, there shouldn't be barriers put in place to my ability as a business, as a big business, or indeed a small business, being able to operate in those other markets around the European Union. And that goes for goods and services. It also goes for things like professional services. Yeah. So if I'm a teacher qualified in one part, or indeed a lawyer, obviously you need to learn the other legal systems, for example, but you should, in theory, be able to operate. Or as a doctor or something like that in other parts of the European Union, because the base skill set is the same wherever you are across the European Union. So making sure that that vision, which was really the founding vision of the European Union, to have this area where countries could collaborate in this very free market way across the different European Union countries, to make sure that vision is a reality is a huge priority for us, but also for other countries in the European Union as well. And coming back to your point about sovereignty, it's really about sort of which is the right level of government at which to take a decision. Yeah. And I know this is a discussion that comes up sometimes in the state of Montana as well. Is it right that actually it's your local, what we might call parish council, so your very local council? Should it be a decision taken there? Should it be a decision taken at your town level, at your city level? Should it be a decision taken by your national government, in our case by Westminster, in your case by Washington DC? Or should it be a decision that's actually taken by a supranational body, in our case by the European Union in Brussels, because it's an issue that really requires that cross-border engagement and collaboration to make it work?
Yes, you're reminding me that we're becoming familiar with the term subsidiarity, which I think is the bedrock principle that you just described in very illustrative terms. I'm glad, and you've been talking about freer trade, so that's a good segue to talking a little bit about a proposal that's on the table and being negotiated now between Washington and the EU called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership.
That's right.
TTIP. And it's a big deal. It involves huge volumes of prospective new transactions and flows of services and goods. There is, and because it's described as a free trade agreement, that reminds people that, the last time we heard a lot about free trade in Montana was with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has proven to be largely a huge success. with Canada, United States, and Mexico, but not without some people suffering some dislocation as a consequence. And just by dint of economic and geographic circumstances, some of the downside effects of freer trade in North America have been realized here in this part. So that just speaks to some of the skepticism people carry, our citizens carry about free trade. Well, is that really going to be, is that for me, or is that for big corporations, big banks? Because as you know, Montana is a small business state. We have some significant corporations, happily, from abroad as well as domestic companies, but the vast majority of people employed in Montana, if they're not in the government sector, are working in small businesses. And they're sometimes harder to convince that free trade is going to really provide benefits to them. So it's a long way of saying, would you say something about Britain's position vis-a-vis this proposed agreement, and what benefits you anticipate realizing if it's successful?
So let me give a bit of context about the agreement first, because this agreement, TTIP, as it's known, is actually a very different type of free trade agreement, and one that is being attempted at a scale that really hasn't been looked at anywhere else. And that's because we're not only looking at tariffs, which is the conventional issue that's generally looked at in free trade agreements. The reality is actually the tariffs between the European Union and the US are relatively low. So it's not a huge barrier to people being able to trade effectively between across the Atlantic. The issue that's being looked at as part of the agreement that really is quite revolutionary is around regulation. So this is looking at, A, where regulations are just unnecessary, where we have regulations in place that we recognise, actually, we just don't need anymore, and they're creating barriers to businesses' ability to operate, let's get rid of them. And then secondly, and perhaps indeed the most importantly, looking at where we can recognise each other's regulations. Not try and create one agreed standard that we're all going to buy into, but me saying, well, instead of having 27 seatbelt regulations between the US and the EU, which currently exist, you'll be surprised to learn, that when I come into Montana, when I get into Missoula Airport and I hire a car, I'm perfectly happy to be in a Montana car seatbelt. And so just accepting that we can recognize each other's regulations. So that is really the prize of this agreement in a way that hasn't been addressed in other agreements before. What does that mean? Well, it means really, I would say three aspects for the US, and in particular Montana. If you look at the US as a whole, where we think, if we think we can get the sort of agreement we're aspiring to, so a really comprehensive agreement looking at both of these aspects, we think that that could bring about $135 billion to the US economy, wow, including about 750,000 new jobs. Those are big numbers. But if you drill that down to the level of the state of Montana, with your own export position as it is at the moment to the European Union, we'd potentially increase Montana's exports to the EU by about 20%, bringing at least 2,500 jobs right here to the state of Montana. So there is a huge prize out there for Montana itself. And coming back to your question about small businesses, this, for me, is one of the huge benefits of us looking at this agreement in the context of regulation. As we all know, big companies can generally put the human resource into studying regulation and managing that regulation. So it's generally less of a barrier for big companies, big multinationals' ability to export globally.